Good day. Today, 29th November, brings more bad news on the battlefields for Ukraine. Now, yesterday, I mentioned over the course of my program that there were reports that the Russian army had entered the village of Khromovo to the northwest of Bakhmut, this being a village which the Wagner organization never captured over the course of their offensive, which led to the capture of Bakhmut itself in the winter and spring of this year. Now, I'd also mentioned about a week before that I'd heard reports that the Ukrainian military had abandoned Khromovo, that Ukrainian troops had actually already withdrawn from Khromovo. Anyway, my comment yesterday that the Russian army appeared to have entered Khromovo, according to one report, elicited the usual pushback, which is fine, by the way. Sometimes this kind of information is indeed premature. But then Boris Rogin, otherwise known as Colonel Kassad, who is one of the most astute and reliable reporters of the war from the Russian side, appeared to confirm it. And then there was a report on Slavyangrad, which said that Ukrainian troops had indeed finally withdrawn from Khromovo. This withdrawal was apparently fully completed yesterday. And today we've had a report from the Russian Ministry of Defense. And the Russian Ministry of Defense says that in Donetsk direction, units of the Yug group of forces supported by aviation and artillery improved the tactical situation at the forward lines and liberated Artyomovskoye. Now, as I understand it, Artyomovskoye is indeed Khromovo. Now, I'm not 100% certain that this is indeed the case, but that at least is my understanding, that this village, Artyomovskoye, is none other than Khromovo. Many of these villages and towns that have been fought over in this war have Russian names, usually the names that they had during the period of the Soviet Union. Bakhmut is known to the Russians as Artyomovsk, as I've discussed many occasions. And they've also got Ukrainian names, and they've got the names that the Russians use. So the Ukrainians call some of these places by one name, and the Russians call it by another. So in my understanding, this is indeed Khromovo. The Artyomovskoye is the Russian name for Khromovo, and the Ukrainians, by contrast, call it Khromovo. Anyway, there we go. Now, this is an important development in the battle lines in Bakhmut. It does seem also, and Boris Rogin has also confirmed it, that the Russians have now regained much of the high ground on the northern flank of Bakhmut, places like the Berkhovka reservoir, but control of Khromovo, which the Wagner organization never achieved, puts the Russians in a strong position to advance onto the next village, which is a bigger village. At least on the maps, it looks like a bigger village, called Bogdanovka. If Bogdanovka is captured, as I have said previously, then essentially the Battle of Bakhmut, which has been ongoing since November of last year in one form or another, the Russians attacking, the Ukrainians then counterattacking in May, Bakhmut itself being captured by the Russians in May, but the Ukrainians seeking to recapture Bakhmut subsequently. Well, if Bogdanovka is captured, the Battle of Bakhmut is in effect over, finally and conclusively. The Russians will have won. It would be extremely difficult from that point on, even theoretically, or so it seems to me, for the Ukrainians to recapture Bakhmut itself. They would have to break through even more fortified lines. The exit and entry points into Bakhmut itself would have been closed. The Russians would be very close to achieving a unified front line west of Bakhmut, which has never been achieved by the Russians up to this point, and which the Russians could defend, preventing the Ukrainians pushing on towards Bakhmut. And of course, all of this is happening alongside other reports that the Russians are on the move on the southern flank of Bakhmut, in Klishchiivka and Avdeyevka. Again, many contradictory reports about this, but my overall sense is that the Russians have reoccupied, or at least if not reoccupied, that they've brought the ruins, their total ruins, of the tiny village of Avdeyevka back behind their front lines. So they, in effect, control Avdeyevka itself, though there is nothing left of that small hamlet except rubble. And it's likely, though not absolutely certain, that the same is true of Klishchiivka as well. And they do seem to be in the process of recapturing the heights around Klishchiivka. So the entire Ukrainian counterattack around Bakhmut will have completely and conclusively failed. Ukraine has lost thousands of men in this counterattack. To reiterate a point I have made before, if you check out the reports, the daily intelligence bulletins provided by the Russian Ministry of Defense, where they provide breakdowns of claimed casualties of Ukrainian troops. And as I said again, I make no claim for the accuracy of these numbers, the exact accuracy, the precise accuracy of these numbers for Ukrainian casualties that the Russians have been providing. But anyway, if you look at these figures, the one thing that they do, I suggest, show is those parts of the battle fronts where the fighting has been most intense. And despite all the drama and attention that the Zaporozhye front has attracted, the area where Ukraine sought to conduct its summer offensive, its famous attempt to break through towards the Sea of Azov, the most intense fighting, the heaviest losses, appear to have been suffered by the Ukrainians in Bakhmut. It is in Bakhmut that the greatest effort by Ukraine over the course of the summer and autumn appears to have been made as they strove to reverse the Russian capture of that small city. And all of those thousands of lives and large numerous pieces of equipment invested by Ukraine, both in the defense of Bakhmut and in the attempt to recapture Bakhmut, well, it increasingly looks like it was all for nothing. With Khromovo, I think we are now finally approaching the point where the Russians not only have control of Bakhmut, but where they have secured control of Bakhmut, where they have consolidated control of the city and of the surrounding areas, and are able, as I said, to set up sustainable front lines which can be relatively straightforwardly defended, if that is what they choose to do. Now, moving forward, there is this endless discussion and controversy about Bakhmut's strategic importance or lack of it. prior to the war, prior rather to the Battle of Bakhmut itself, and for some time after the Battle of Bakhmut started, I can well remember Western officials, whenever they discussed the battle, telling us how strategically important Bakhmut was and how Bakhmut sat upon a spider's web of road and railway links, how it connected together and knit together Ukrainian defences in in the northern and western parts of the Donbass, how the loss of Bakhmut would be for the Ukrainians a major strategic defeat. And then, of course, when it became increasingly clear that the Russians were likely to capture Bakhmut, all that changed. We were then told that Bakhmut had minimal strategic significance. It was basically unimportant, that the Ukrainian attempts to defend Bakhmut and then to recapture Bakhmut were a shocking waste of resources and symptomatic of obsessional thinking on the part of Zelensky and his officials. And we were also told that there are much stronger defense lines, potential defense lines, to the west of Bakhmut that the Ukrainians can supposedly hold as they try to prevent further Russian advances westward towards places like Kramatorsk and Slavyansk. Well, that then became the official line, and it is one which has been endlessly repeated and recycled ever since, and which I've noticed that even some commentators on the Russian side are now adopting. Endless repetition, as it so often does, makes something appear to be true. My own view is that I find it difficult to believe that even Zelensky and his officials, people like this, would have shown as much interest in defending Bakhmut as they did if the place was really as unimportant as is now being said, as so unimportant to the larger strategic nature of the war. The Russians haven't been able to exploit their capture of Bakhmut up to this point because of two things that have happened since May, when Bakhmut finally fell under their control. Firstly, the capture of Bakhmut was in a kind of a sense incomplete. The Wagner forces withdrew from Bakhmut directly after the metropolitan area of the town was captured. The surrounding villages had been largely, but not entirely, captured. Three important villages, Khromovo, Bogdanovka, and Ivanivska, the latter the Russians call Krasnoye, remained under Ukrainian control. So before the Russians could make best use of whatever advantage the capture of Bakhmut gave them, they needed to complete the work that the Wagner organization had started and capture those three villages. Well, it looks like they've now captured one. The second was that, of course, they had to repel the Ukrainian counterattack. The Ukrainian counterattack in the Bakhmut area itself, which began, in fact, on the 10th of May, before Bakhmut itself was actually captured by the Russians, and the general Ukrainian counteroffensive along the entire southern front lines, which began on the 4th of June. So this has delayed the opportunity for the Russians to exploit their control of this town. The Ukrainian counteroffensive, virtually everyone now acknowledges, has failed. Apparently, yesterday, there was a meeting of EU foreign ministers the Hungarian foreign minister tells us that even there, it was generally acknowledged amongst the foreign ministers that the Ukrainian counteroffensive of the summer had ended in failure. So the Ukrainian counteroffensive is over. The Ukrainian counterattack around Bakhmut, which in a sense is a part of that larger Ukrainian offensive, that too is over. The Russians now have Khromovo. Presumably before long they will also take Bogdanovka. Once Bogdanovka is captured, Ukrainian retention of Ivaniivka, Krasnoye if you prefer, begins to look extremely difficult, and the Russians will have full control of Bakhmut and its surrounding area, and they will be in a position at that point, at a time and place of their choosing, to exploit the strategic advantages that the control of Bakhmut gives them. And there's already been some talk about a Russian advance towards Chasov Yar, the next big town, well, at least it's not a particularly big town, the next town to the west of Bakhmut, now apparently also largely rubble, but a town which I clearly remember a Ukrainian soldier back during the Battle of Bakhmut telling a Western journalist, I think from the Daily Telegraph, telling this journalist that Chasov Yar itself is undefendable. The topography around it and the relatively small size of the town and the structure of the town, basically small houses, not the apartment buildings and industrial facilities that we see in Bakhmut. In its totality, that makes Chasov Yar also undefendable. If Chasov Yar is captured by the Russians, then that opens the way to other places further to the west. There's another town, I believe it's called Konstantinovka. I can't exactly remember its name, but it's apparently about 13 kilometers further west. It has been used by Ukraine as the location of the headquarters of the Ukrainian group of forces which has been defending Bakhmut. So anyway, we shall see what happens next. Anyway, that's one piece of bad news from Ukraine, for Ukraine, which came through yesterday. There have been other reports of other events happening elsewhere on the battlefronts as well. Now, Bakhmut was the big story in Ukraine, the fighting for Ukraine for most of this year. Avdeyevka has become the big story now. Now, there are more reports coming from Avdeyevka. They're not always clear. It seems that the Russians are steadily consolidating control of Avdeyevka. But I saw a report that the Russians, this is in fact comes from Boris Rogin again, that the Russians are in the process of repelling an attack on their positions in the northern part of Stepovoye, this village to the west of the railway. Now, there were some reports which I mentioned yesterday that the Russians had actually withdrawn from Stepovoye. Boris Rogin tends to be an extremely reliable commentator and reporter, and he clearly believes, and clearly is reporting, and I suspect actually knows, that the Russians are indeed still in that particular village. And there are, in fact, further reports, there was a cascade of reports yesterday, that there is an intense encounter battle underway in this area to the west of the railway track. The Russians have been trying to move more troops into it, towards it, across the railway track. The Ukrainians have been launching intense artillery and drone strikes to the extent that they can on these advancing Russian forces. But it does look as if steadily, gradually, incrementally, the Russians are gaining ascendancy in this particular battle. And Dima, at the Military Summary Channel, said, I think it was yesterday, that the Russians appear to have achieved electronic dominance, if I can call it that. Their jamming of Ukrainian drones in this area appears to have become increasingly dense and effective, and that strongly pointed to the likelihood of further Russian advances in this particular part of the Avdeyevka battlefield. And it looks as if Dima is right. It looks as if the Russians have been able to hold on to their gains at the moment and are gradually reinforcing their forces west of the railway track and are gradually, slowly strengthening their positions and are preparing to advance further west. Now, again, we go back to what a Ukrainian soldier recently told El País, the Spanish newspaper. If the Russians not only cross the railway, but are able to send large, significant numbers of armour, tanks and such things west of the railway, then it is curtains over for Ukraine in Avdeyevka. The Ukrainian position in Avdeyevka will collapse. As I discussed on a recent programme with my colleague and friend Alex Christoforou on the Duran, the way in which the fighting in Avdeyevka has evolved since the first Russian attacks in this area back in March of this year is that Avdeyevka now lies at the very end of a salient. In that program, I compared it to a tube in which the Russians control three sides, the north, the south, and the east. Perhaps a sock is an even better simile. I would say that Avdeyevka itself is right at the toe end of the sock. And what is happening is that the Russians have now managed to advance in the southwest. That's through the ball of the foot, if you like. And they are also putting pressure in the north, where, in the north, in other words, in the area where the front end of the foot meets the leg. And to some extent, they're even putting some pressure on the heel as well. So that perhaps gives you some idea of how this particular fight is now developing. Anyway, if the Russians are able to cross the railway, cut off the roads, cut off all the communications into Avdeyevka, then they have closed the top end of the sock. The Ukrainian troops in the toe end of the sock, in Avdeyevka itself, are essentially cut off from resupply. Now, I saw a report, again, I think it was on Slavyangrad, that the distance now is that the Russians need to cover is now down to 3 kilometers. Still greater than would be needed to close off the road to vehicle traffic entirely. It's become clear to me from many accounts of this fighting that one needs to get very close to a road in order to be able to stop vehicles moving up and down the road entirely. One would need to come sufficiently close to be able to use anti-tank missiles and such things to close the road. And it seems to me that the Russians aren't at that point yet. But they do seem to be getting closer. In the meantime, the Ukrainians, obviously aware of all of this, are busy still rushing reserves, or at least not reserves, rushing, redeploying troops from various areas of the battle lines to the Avdeyevka area to try to keep the top of the SOC open, to prevent it being closed by the Russians. And in doing that, they're burning through their forces very fast. Now, there is an enigma about the fighting around Avdeyevka, which is about the exact numbers of troops that are committed to this battle. The Ukrainians say that the Russians have around 40,000 troops operating in the Avdeyevka area. I saw some other reports from the Russian side that they're actually outnumbered 3-1 by the Ukrainians in the Avdeyevka area. I am come to the view that probably the Russians have many more troops than they're admitting to in and around Avdeyevka. If the Ukrainians really did outnumber them 3-1, then it seems that the Russians would have perhaps 10,000, 12,000 men fighting around Avdeyevka, which seems to me far too few given the complexity and scale of this battle. The Ukrainians say that the Russians have around 40,000 men, and I think that's about right. Anyway, so Avdeyevka, news there, very bad, getting worse. Russians apparently, definitely west of the railway track, gradually consolidating their positions, preparing to advance further, and real worries about Avdeyevka potentially falling, and falling perhaps fairly soon, with the Ukrainians also facing the nightmare scenario of the emergence of a cauldron if the SOC is closed before the Ukrainian troops in Avdeyevka itself at the toe end are able to retreat out. And as I said, that will be a much more difficult operation to carry out, it seems to me, because of the distance that would be required and because of the Russian lines, the areas under Russian control that we've seen, the length of the funnel, if you like, that the Russians control, the sides that the Russians control. So it'll be a difficult operation to carry out. The time scale in which it can be carried out is closing, but it's a much more difficult operation anyway than it was in, say, Bakhmut or Lysychansk, where the Ukrainians were able to pull their men out before the pincers closed. Of course, they never did fully close in the case of Bakhmut. We would be looking more at a scenario rather like the one in Mariupol, where the Ukrainian troops were indeed surrounded and choked off inside a cauldron. So that, I would have thought, would be the ultimate disaster for the Ukrainians. It's one which, logically, I would have thought that they would want to avoid, but for the moment, they're taking no step that points in that direction. Anyway, I'm just going to finish this discussion about Avdeyevka with saying what a very, very sophisticated and complex operation it is that the Russians are carrying out in Avdeyevka. Now, I'm not a military expert, and I'm not making any making any tactical judgments, but to my inexpert eye, the operation around Avdeyevka with aircraft being used, drones being used in huge scale, with electronic jamming operating in the most sophisticated way, with the Russians creating tunnels and exploding mines under, filling up these tunnels with explosives and blowing them up beneath Ukrainian defenses. and with the various movements and tactical adjustments that the Russians are conducting and their very complex use of armor and such things, this is, or so it seems to me, immeasurably more sophisticated and complex than was the case in the battles at Mariupol and Bakhmut. And by comparison, and maybe I'm being unfair here, but by comparison, those battles look almost crude by comparison with this one. And that may explain, by the way, why this one is proceeding so much faster, would maybe be one of the reasons why it is proceeding so much faster. But I would say also that when he's seeing the Russians using all kinds of systems in ways that have not been used before. So they've actually themselves deployed automated mine-laying vehicles. They sort of launch mines into the air, which then scatter and cover fields. They've actually themselves used these vehicles to scatter mines behind the Ukrainian defences in Avdeyevka, in order to complicate Ukrainian advances. And they've also been using cluster munitions to strike at Ukrainian forces in the fields. They use these RBK 500 cluster bombs, precision guided apparently, dropped by Sukhoi 34 fighter bombers, presumably. And they've been using them very effectively, apparently, against the Ukrainian forces. And of course, we saw nothing like that in the battles in Mariupol or Bakhmut. And on the topic of the RBK 500s, there's been some discussion about why the Ukrainians are so, apparently they're very shocked by the effectiveness of these cluster bombs. And there's questions as to why these cluster bombs the Russians are dropping on the Ukrainians are proving so much more deadly and so much more effective than the shells with cluster munitions that the Ukrainians have been launching against the Russians, and the rockets, the multiple rocket launch systems that both sides are firing at each other, which use which use cluster munitions. Why these bombs are proving so devastating? I think there's a very straightforward reason, which is that these bombs are very big. They're 500 kilos, and that is a much bigger container of cluster munitions than you could put inside a shell or inside a rocket system. So one can see why these would be devastating things. And anyway, the Russians are using them too. I say this because, of course, there's been lots of talk about how the Russians have shown no ability to conduct combined arms warfare in Ukraine, in offensives in Ukraine. Well, it seems to me that they are now doing so in Avdeyevka, and the sooner this is acknowledged, the better. Anyway, there we are. Bad situation for the Ukrainians in Avdeyevka as well. Apparently, things are not going well for them in other places as well. There's been more reports that the Russians are now moving steadily forward in the Vremevka salient area, specifically towards the village of Staromayorsk, which the Ukrainians captured to enormous, or at least pushed the Russians out of, to enormous praise in the Western media in August. Apparently, the 4 Marine brigades that were deployed by Ukraine in the Vremevka salient, well, they've all been redeployed to Kherson region where they're trying to cross the river. More about that shortly. And the defense of Staromayorsk and the Vremivka salient area on the Ukrainian side is apparently essentially now down to one regular army brigade, supplemented with various territorial army brigades, the latter being essentially infantry brigades. They lack heavy mechanized equipment. And this is apparently the case in the Vremivka salient, and it looks as if here again, with the key forces redeployed to other places, in this case the Kherson region, it seems that the Russians steadily, incrementally, are making further advances. And last but not least, according to reports that were coming out yesterday, it seems as if the Russians are making, finally, significant progress, both in the Kupiansk area and a little further to the south in the what might be described as the Liman-Seversk area. In the latter, it seems that they are very close now to capturing this village of Blagodatnoye, which has been fought over so many times in northern Lugansk region. And a little further to the north, there are discordant reports about what's happening in this village of Sinkovka on the Sinkovka ledge, which is close to Kupiansk, which the Russians would need to capture if they were to advance on Kupiansk itself. There's some reports that the Russians have entered this village and are successfully repelling Ukrainian counterattacks there. Boris Rogin said that the Ukrainians have approached this village. Slightly different accounts, but anyway, it does seem as if the Russians have been advancing here also. And there are some suggestions that before long the Russians will activate fully their forces and move on towards Kupiansk. I noticed that again, according to Russian Defense Ministry reports, there's been an uptick in Russian-claimed Ukrainian losses in the Kupiansk area, which could be a sign that the fighting there is indeed becoming much more intense. Perhaps another clue that the Russians have some important objectives in mind for this particular area is that, according to the Pentagon, apparently, it is in this area of Kupiansk and Liman that the largest concentration of Russian forces is to be found. According to the Pentagon, I'm taking this information from Simplicius, the Thinker's site, by the way. There are between 100 and 150,000 Russian troops concentrated in this area of the northern front lines. That compares with 70,000 Russian troops in the Donbass, of whom I'm guessing the majority are concentrated in around two places, in the fighting for Avdeyevka and in the fighting in Bakhmut. So one gets a sense that very big Russian forces are being assembled here. And of course, there are lots of reports and rumors of huge Russian forces on the Russian border with Kharkiv region, preparing to advance into Ukraine from the north. There's been lots of Russian military activity around the northern town of Sumy on Ukraine's northern border with Russia. Lots of reconnaissance troops regularly cross the border from Russia into Ukraine, close to Sumy, and there are large numbers of drones and reconnaissance drones and strike drones apparently deployed around Sumy. Anyway, one does get a sense that there is a gathering storm, if you like, building up around Kupiansk and in this area. And perhaps these forces are going to be activated fully sometime after the new year, presumably once whatever shaping operations are currently taking place around Kupiansk have run their course. It's interesting also that it seems that the Ukrainians have deployed their Abrams tanks to this area, and perhaps some of their other advanced equipment. The Bradleys and the Leopards too seem to be principally now around Avdeyevka, and the Russian and the Abrams tanks are also now starting to appear around Kupiansk. And that may be a sign also that the Ukrainians are becoming nervous about the gathering storm. Anyway, before I finish this summary of the events on the battlefronts, and today I'm not going to discuss the various drone wars that are taking place, suffice to say that the Russians conduct drone operations against Ukraine every night now, and the Ukrainians try to do the same against the Russians, but with increasing limited success as far as I can see. But anyway, before I finish discussing these military developments, let me just make one rather curious point about official Russian reporting of this war. We've just seen that the Russian Ministry of Defense has just confirmed the capture of the village, which I assume is Khromovo. If you were getting all your information about the progress of the war from the Russian Ministry of Defense, you would not know that the Russians were on the attack in this direction. In order to get that information, you have to go to Russian telegram sites like Slavyangrad, Rybar, Wargonzo, all of those. The Russian Defense Ministry scarcely ever discusses operations in any way. And, interestingly, it has said nothing about an ongoing offensive in Avdeyevka. In fact, I've noticed that the Russian Defense Ministry is not even properly reporting Ukrainian casualties, let alone Russian casualties, in Avdeyevka. And there seems to be some kind of order that has been imposed, not just by the Russian Defense Ministry on themselves, but by the Russian Defense Ministry and the Russian government on Russian officials in general, not to talk about Avdeyevka, about the fight, the battle that is going on there. And take this interview, which Pushilin's advisor, Pushilin being, of course, the head of the Donetsk regional government. Anyway, Pushilin's advisor, Yan Gagin, gave today to TASS. He says this, and I'm quoting directly from TASS now. The abandoned Ukrainian positions near Donetsk are strewn with a huge number of bodies of Ukrainian soldiers who were abandoned. In fleeing the area, the enemy did not even try to evacuate them. We have counted about 200 dead Ukrainian soldiers so far. Now, note this interesting expression, the abandoned Ukrainian positions near Donetsk. It doesn't tell you where this is supposed to have happened. It's obvious, however, to anybody who's been following the progress of the war as carefully as I have been doing, that what Gagin is talking about is Avdeyevka, and specifically the industrial zone, which has just been captured by the Russians. It is there that Gagin is saying that the Russians found all these bodies of Ukrainian soldiers. Now, I'm going to suggest that here we see another consequence of Prigozhin and of the Battle of Bakhmut. Prigozhin, as we all remember, whilst the Battle of Bakhmut was underway, was giving us essentially a non-stop commentary about what was happening in Bakhmut. And of course, this commentary became increasingly self-aggrandizing, I have to use that word, and it also became increasingly critical of the Russian Defense Ministry, and eventually things escalated to the point that relations between the Russian Defense Ministry and Prigozhin completely broke down, leading to his mutiny in June. Well, I suspect that what has happened is that one of the lessons that the Defense Ministry has taken away from that is that no one with any official or semi-official position in the Russian government is allowed any longer to discuss in such detail operational affairs as Prigozhin did. The result is that Russian officials are unable to speak openly about the battle in Avdeyevka, and we have very little information about what is going on in Avdeyevka, and the intention is not to allow a Prigozhin-type figure to re-emerge. One can understand the reasoning behind this, but of course it does make getting a handle of what is actually going on for someone like me much more difficult. Now, as I said, this is the point where I finish my summary of what's going on the battlefields. I will just add one thing, which is that there is increasing exasperation on the part of some Russian commentators, Ryba being a case in point, about the way in which the Russians are handling the situation in Krinky on the west bank of the Dnieper River. About 2 days ago, there was lots of news about how the Russians had launched an attack on Krinky, how the bridgehead had contracted to around 2 square kilometers, that the Ukrainian troops in Krinky were under a great deal of extreme pressure, and a lot of these same Russian commentators then became very optimistic that the bridgehead was about to be extinguished entirely. And then, having reduced the bridgehead, the Russians withdrew and allowed it to expand again. And I noticed that Ryba, well, not give me his actual name, but anyway, he was extremely frustrated about this and very bewildered as to why the Russians are playing this strange game in Krinky, allowing this bridgehead to continue there. He went through possible explanations, but he didn't think any one of them was satisfactory. And he made it fairly clear that he thought that whatever game it is that the Russians are playing is a mistaken one, and he seemed to worry that the Russian Ministry of Defense is not taking the situation seriously enough. Well, I don't know what game the Russians are playing in Krinky. What is the game the Russians are playing in Krinky either? This isn't for me to try and guess. I would repeat again simply this. I think that the situation in Krinky is that the Ukrainian troops are isolated there, that what is happening at the moment is that they can't advance beyond the territory of this tiny bridgehead, and they're having to expend a disproportionate share of their resources to keep this bridgehead in existence. And it is the latter, perhaps even more than the actual casualties, that I think the Russians are working to continue. They are again depleting the Ukrainians by obliging the Ukrainians to take these very desperate steps that they're taking to try to keep this bridgehead in existence. Anyway, this is, as I said, something of an enigma. We will no doubt find out in due course what the mystery is. But when talking about Krinky, that brings me to a meeting that took place in Moscow, where President Putin addressed the plenary session of the World Russian People's Council. Now, he addressed them, I should say, by video conference. He himself, I believe, was in Sochi, or maybe he is in Moscow and this meeting took place in Sochi. I'm not absolutely sure. But anyway, he delivered an important speech there. Anyway, following that speech, he appears to have had a discussion with Vladimir Sladko, the head of the Russian-appointed Kherson regional government. And Sladko has been telling people that after speaking with Putin himself, and after speaking with various Russian military people who were also attending this conference, he received assurances that the Russian government, that the Russian military absolutely intend to regain control of Kherson region on the west bank of the Dnieper River, including Kherson city, the place that the Russians withdrew from in the autumn of last year. That it is fully the plan eventually to retake control of that area. And Sladko went further. He also said that the Russians, he wasn't told this perhaps quite so directly, but he said that when he spoke to Putin, Putin hinted to him that the Russians do eventually intend to move even further west, to take control of Odessa, Nikolaev, and Izmail, these important towns once captured by Catherine the Great on the southern coast of Ukraine, on the coast of the Baltic Sea, providing a land bridge for the Russians all the way up to Transnistria. Now, this is interesting, to put it mildly. It does beg some questions as to how that would be done. It would mean the Russians crossing the Dnieper again, presumably, or carrying out some sort of amphibious landings, plural, on the Black Sea coast, which would be a very complex operation, and which would probably require the Black Sea Fleet to be significantly reinforced above what it is now. Something, by the way, which is by no means impossible. As I've said already, the Russians would be able to send missile boats through the various canals and river systems into the Black Sea, which would enable them to reinforce their forces, their Black Sea Fleet there, should they choose to do that. Of course, the alternative is that the Russians eventually intend to advance over the Dnieper, further north, and move basically from the northeast southwards towards this territory. In other words, it would not be an advance along the coast, where the Russians, by the way, would not only have to cross the Dnieper, but various other rivers as well, including the Dniester, which is further west. So anyway, we will see how the Russians plan to do that. But this now brings me to this speech that Putin gave at this conference, and it was a most interesting conference. First thing to say is that it was striking how much emphasis Putin gave to orthodoxy, Russian orthodoxy. And I want to stress Russian orthodoxy as a unifying factor, as a critical factor in forming Russian identity. And the Patriarch was present and attended this conference. And there were other representatives of the Russian Orthodox Church there and of other religious organizations. And it was, however, certain things that he said about Russia itself that I found extremely interesting. And first of all, he made it clear that Russia cannot exist without the Russians, the Russian ethnicity, that they are the ethnicity that brings together all of the vast lands and territories and nations that together make up Russia. And then he said something which I find very interesting. He said this: the West has no need for such a large and multi-ethnic country as Russia as a matter of principle. Our diversity and unity of cultures, traditions, languages, and ethnicities simply do not fit into the logic of Western racists and colonizers. In their cruel plans for total depersonalization, separation, and suppression and exploitation. That's why they have started their old rant again. They say that Russia is a prison of nations and that Russians are a nation of slaves. We have heard this many times throughout the centuries. Now we have also heard that Russia apparently needs to be decolonized. But what do they really want? They want to dismember and plunder Russia. If they cannot do it by force, they sow discord. So he is saying that Russia is different from Western countries. It is a country, a multi-ethnic, multicultural country, made up of many different nationalities. But there is the glue that holds it together, which is, of course, the Russian people. And the Russian people have their own distinct culture, which derives, in part at least, from orthodoxy, from Russian orthodoxy. And he says that Westerners are not only unable to understand this, but to some extent they are provoked and antagonistic to it, because as part of their, I suppose he would say, imperial drive, their instinct is to divide peoples up rather than to bring them consensually together. And of course, he said that a country like Russia, in a struggle with the West, it can only exist as a multi-ethnic country in the way that it does, and that it is therefore, as it is pitted against the West, it is therefore fighting, in effect, for its very existence. And he gave warnings that the Russians need to remain together, or the various Russias, if you like, need to remain together. And he said that they need to be wary both of external aggression, but also of internal, outside interference and provocations intended to incite ethnic or religious conflict. And he makes it clear that he clearly therefore sees any attempt to create internal issues within Russia, largely as a product of external interference. He says that naturally, our natural condition is for us all to live peacefully and happily together, harmoniously together. If that ceases to happen, then it is almost entirely or largely because of the interference of the West. That at least is the sense that I got. But then he made some very interesting points which touch on directly upon the present conflict in Ukraine. He says, I believe we all remember and must remember the lessons of the 1917 revolution, the subsequent civil war, and the disintegration of the USSR in 1991. It may seem like many years have passed since then, but people of all ethnicities living today, even those born in the 21st century, are still paying now, decades later, for the miscalculations made at that time. Indulgences in separatist illusions, the weakness of the central authority, and a policy of artificial, forced division in this large Russian nation, a triune of Russians, Belarusians, and Ukrainians. Now, notice those words, a policy of artificial and forced division in the large Russian nation, a triune of Russians, Belarusians, and Ukrainians. What Putin is essentially saying here, again, and he's started to say this more and more, is that Russians, Belarusians, and Ukrainians are essentially one nation, the Russian nation. They are branches, 3 branches of the great tree. The Russians are, of course, the biggest branch by far, but the Belarusians and the Ukrainians are also branches of that tree. That trying to isolate them and separate them from each other was a miscalculation and indulgence in separatist illusions. Now, all of that would be interesting enough, but of course it does beg some rather interesting questions, because of course it leads us logically, in conditions where there is a conflict underway in Ukraine at the moment, to a possible endpoint in this conflict. If the division of Russians, Belarusians, and Ukrainians was artificial and forced, was an artificial and forced division of the large Russian nation, and if it arose as a result of miscalculations and indulgences of separatist illusions, then surely the logical thing, as Russia moves ever deeper into Ukraine, is to bring this artificial and forced division to an end. Now, I'm not saying that Putin has yet come to the point of saying that we have to bring all of these nations back together into one state, but we are getting ever closer to that point. And of course, if you follow the logic of this even further, he would say, yes, there is a distinct Belarusian identity and a distinct Ukrainian identity, but these identities exist within the Russian whole as part of this single nation that makes up, but is the glue itself the glue that holds Russia together. It is part of this single nation in just the same way as, say, Saxons and Bavarians have their own identities, but a part of the greater German nation and state, of which they are, of course, an important component part. So I think we can start to see where this war is taking us. Putin really didn't talk like this, in this kind of way, before the conflict, the current armed period of the conflict started. And, of course, during the negotiations in March last year, that was not part of the agenda at all. At that time, Putin was exclusively seeking to keep Ukraine out of NATO, to seek to secure the position of Donbass and Crimea, and perhaps eventually and ultimately to ensure protections for the rights of Russian speakers, as he would have at that time called them, in Ukraine itself. That agreement was thrown away, and a year and a half later, we see Putin talking about the triune of the Russians, Belarusians, and Ukrainians, severed from each other as a result of the policy of artificial forced division of the large Russian nation. So we could see how the catastrophic decision to separate, to reject those that agreement that was reached in March, where it has potentially brought us to. And of course, what Putin is saying here is absolutely in line with what has been said by those other Russian officials, by Lavrov, by Shoigu, and most importantly by Vyacheslav Volodin, the Speaker of the Duma, when he said that Ukraine's choice is really very simple. It either submits completely to Russian demands, or it confronts the prospect of the Ukrainian state as we have known it ceasing to exist. Anyway, that brings us to the peace agreement that was almost agreed in March and April of last year. And we've now had a cascade of articles and reports and commentaries discussing the failure of that peace agreement. We've had the report that appeared in Germany, put together by Michael Schulenberg and General Kuyat. We've had the incredible interview given by David Arachmamia, sorry, I never get that gentleman's name correct, the Ukrainian lead negotiator. We've had lots of comments from President Erdogan, from Prime Minister Bennett of Israel, from Chancellor Scholz, apparently, of Germany, from all sorts of others, telling us that the reason that negotiation failed and the war continued was because of the decision of the Western powers, of the United States and Britain, to sabotage that deal, and in particular because of the specific role of Boris Johnson, who David Arachamia and Schulenberg and Kuyat, and by the way, Bennett and Erdogan and Cavusoglu and all of the others all tell us, came to Kiev and told the Ukrainians, look, you can't proceed with this plan. You've got to fight on until you win. We will give you all the support you need in order to win. We've got Putin and the Russians on the run, so why stop now? And even if you do decide to stop at this point, we're not going to give you the security guarantees that you are looking for, so that you will be exposed to further potential pressure from the Russians. So I've said many times that the role of Boris Johnson and of the British government potentially puts the leaves the British in a deeply exposed position. And sure enough, an article has appeared in Reuters, which I suspect illustrates the nervousness, the increasing nervousness that the British must be feeling. Now, this article is actually an old article. It dates to the 14th of September, 2022. People are discussing it now. I don't think that everybody has realized that this is an old article. And I have touched on it in the past. But the fact that it's now apparently being circulated again suggests to me that someone in London is keen to try and draw attention to it. And that's why we're increasingly seeing it. Anyway, this article by Reuters, dated the 14th of September 2022, says that the reason there was no peace settlement in Ukraine was not because of Boris Johnson's role, not because of the British government's role. It was entirely the fault of Putin himself. And we have this story, and I do emphasize it is a story, being put together. I just read a few parts of what it says. Vladimir Putin's chief envoy on Ukraine told the Russian leader as the war began that he had struck a provisional deal with Kiev that would satisfy Russia's demand that Ukraine stay out of NATO. But Putin rejected it and pressed ahead with his military campaign, according to 3 people close to the Russian leadership. The Ukrainian-born envoy, Dmitry Kozak, told Putin that he believed the deal he had hammered out removed the need for Russia to pursue a large-scale occupation of Ukraine, according to these sources. Kozak's recommendation to Putin to adopt the deal is being reported by Reuters for the first time. Again, let me stress, we're talking now, this article is 14th September 2022. It's from last year. And the article goes on to say Putin had repeatedly asserted prior to the war that NATO and its military infrastructure were creeping closer to Russia's borders by accepting new members from Eastern Europe, and that the alliance was now preparing to bring Ukraine into its orbit too. Putin publicly said that it represented an existential threat to Russia, forcing him to react. But despite earlier backing the negotiations, Putin made it clear when presented with Kozak's deal that the concessions negotiated by his aide did not go far enough, and that he had expanded his objectives to annexing swathes of Russian territory. So it was Putin's fault that it all failed, because he actually wanted to carry out a land grab. And then Reuters does acknowledge that when asked about this, Peskov, Putin's spokesman, said that this account had absolutely no relation to reality. No such thing had ever happened. It is absolutely incorrect information. Now, let me say again, because as I said, I know that this story is now being revived by some people in London. It is, I'm sure, bilge. The first thing to say is that I don't know whether Kozak had any role in the negotiations between the Russians and the Ukrainians in March and April 2022. But if he did, he was certainly not the lead negotiator. The lead negotiator on the Russian side was not Kozak. It was Vladimir Medinsky, who had formerly been the Russian culture minister, and alongside him was Alexander Fomin, who is a general in the Russian Defense Ministry. So it's difficult to understand how Kozak could have negotiated a deal separately whilst the negotiations were being conducted by Medinsky, in which, as far as I know, as I said, he wasn't playing an important role. But what is true is that Kozak was representing Russia in the four-part discussions that were taking place before the war to achieve implementation of the Minsk agreement. And he was the lead Russian negotiator in those talks. But again, what this Reuters report does not say is that Kozak reported to not just Putin, but to the Russian Security Council on the 21st of February 2022. This is the famous televised discussion which led to Putin's decision to recognize the independence of Donetsk and Lugansk, and that Kozak, as part of his report, spoke about the Ukrainian conduct of the negotiations in scathing terms, and far from suggesting that there was any prospect of an agreement, he told Putin and the Security Council, and it is on television, that the talks were at a deadlock. So this story has no foundation. Now, any story from Reuters based on information from Russian sources, senior Russian government sources, is almost by definition suspect. Even in September 2022, I wonder how Reuters was able to get access to these sources. And we learned, for example, that two of the three sources said that a push to get the deal finalized occurred immediately after Russia's February 24th invasion, which, as I said, makes no sense at all because, as I said, it was Medinsky, not Kozak, who was conducting the negotiations from that point. And others, however, say that the third source differed on the timing, saying that Kozak had proposed a deal to Putin and had it rejected just before the invasion. But as we see, just before the invasion, he was actually in public reporting to Putin that, on the contrary, the negotiations with the Ukrainians, which, let me stress, were about the Minsk agreement, that those negotiations were at a total deadlock. Now, who could these three anonymous Russian sources be? Well, I don't know, but I would say that over the last couple of years, we've had a report which was widely circulated in the British and American media, one authored by a person, Christopher Steele, which claimed to be based on Russian sources. And we've now had three reports which have appeared in the United States by Robert Mueller, by Michael Horowitz, and by John Duran, all of which basically agree that it was based on no such thing. I've no idea who these three Russian sources that Reuters claims to have spoken to were, but I do wonder, I have to say, after that experience with Christopher Steele's dossier, I do have deep skepticism about their reality. Anyway, let me reiterate again, any attempt by the British to divert focus from themselves about the collapse of the negotiations in April is simply does not stand up to examination. This story in Reuters, to me at least, makes absolutely no sense at all. It seems to me that it is clearly contradicted by what we know from the public record. And if you want to get a sense of the public record, then I would suggest look at the interview that David Arachamia has given. That's the lead Ukrainian negotiator. You can find it all over the place. It's reported in many places now. And also read that German report authored by Schulenberg and Kuyat, which I have been talking about. Now, I'm going to finish. I'm just going to go back and I'm going to finish this program. I'm going to deal only with Ukraine today. I'm going to just finish by going back to something else that Putin said in his speech, which I did find extremely interesting. He made it fairly clear that, like increasing numbers of Russians today, he sees a deep continuity in Russian history. He accepts that there have been changes of government, changes in political system, that there have been revolutions and such things, but he sees a continuum. He doesn't see breaks. He says this. He said this: I would like to draw your attention to certain things that the Holy Patriarch mentioned. He quoted a Soviet song, "We will destroy the world," and so on. As His Holiness said, we will create a new building on the debris. That was what the Soviet government planned after the 1917 Socialist Revolution. Everything seemed to be debris, but I believe that it was not debris, but seeds from which a new Russian and Soviet statehood grew. Because only 24 years later, despite all the attempts to root out both the religious mindset and our cultural roots, still 24 years later, let me just remind you, the Great Patriotic War started. And what happened? Remember how Molotov addressed the Soviet people with news about the war breaking out? How did he address them? Citizens. And a few days later, Stalin addressed them as brothers and sisters. They immediately remembered about God, church, and our eternal traditions. The last, by the way, I am sure would have greatly surprised Molotov and Stalin about the bit about God, church, and our eternal traditions. But the point is that there is a continuity, that the statehood that developed after the Soviet Revolution, the Soviet Union, in other words, is itself simply another expression of Russia. And elsewhere in his speech, he actually talked about this. He said that Russia has evolved over time, that it has been, the Russian world means ancient Rus, the Tsardom of Muscovy, the Russian Empire, the Soviet Union, and modern Russia, which is reclaiming, consolidating, and augmenting its sovereignty as a global power. So, you can be a Russian today. You can take pride in the achievements of the Soviet Union, in pride in the achievements of Tsarist Russia. There is no reason why you should not, because these previous expressions of statehood were as much expressions of Russian statehood as Russia is itself is today. And that, I think, is a view which the overwhelming majority of Russians share. They do not divide up, chop up their history into separate periods and treat each one as unique to itself in the way that some people in the West do. And I think that this will be a developing theme, not just in Putin's speeches, but in those of Russian political leaders overall. Anyway, I will finish on that point. There'll be more from me soon. I'm sure there'll be more developments on the battlefronts, and we'll see further where this particular war is going. So just to remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. Don't forget to go to our shop, buy yourself the amazing things that you will find there, our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, all those great things. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to press the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.